It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this all winter. And I was thinking as I came in here this morning, metaphors really abound. Here we are on Victoria Day weekend, usually a time for getting the garden in or getting the screens on or opening the cottage, a time of year when we are looking forward to the rebirth of the earth and the growth in our gardens. And here we are meeting in the Canadian Legion, a subtle or maybe not so subtle reminder that we are able to do big things. We have done big things. And when we are determined and when the motivation is sufficient, the abilities of human communities to band together and do what needs to be done should never be underestimated. And we tend to underestimate it. I think as we get older, we underestimate it even more. And I was kind of amused about telling it like it is and positivity being set up as two opposites. And I get that, and there's certainly a lot of negative news around the climate change issue. But like all things human, this is a mishmash of black and white and good and bad and hopeful and not hopeful. In other words, it's humans doing what they've always done, which is muddling through one problem after another. I don't want to belittle the magnitude of the challenge that we're facing, but neither do I want to encourage despair, because I honestly don't think that there's any point in it, and I'm not sure there's really an historical basis for taking that stance. Here, for example, is a map of the world. This was considered the best map of the world, by Europeans anyway, in 1490. There is no North America. And the shape of Africa is almost comical. This is 2 years before Columbus sailed. This is like 1507, so this is 15 years later. North America now looks like a big reef that the explorers and the European sailors ran into when they set off for the Far East. Much to their surprise, bumped into the Americas, which at first they didn't realize was a continent. There are some maps that show it as just basically like barrier reefs and barrier islands. But it wasn't long before they realized that there was a whole new world, at least again from the European perspective. If I had more time, I'd do a whole thing on maps. There's one I really love where Newfoundland is connected directly to China, but might explain quite a bit. But the point of these is just that the way we see ourselves is always changing. We all grew up with these iconic pictures taken from space of Earth, which finally drove home the point that we're on a circular planet, not a linear planet. There are no edges. You can't push the waste off the edge. You know, in my early career as an environmentalist, I was out in British Columbia where we were trying to stop uranium mining from proceeding in the Okanagan Valley, if you can imagine. And Kelowna was also the home of the Premier of British Columbia. And the Bennett's had a hardware store, Bennett's Hardware Store in Kelowna, which the local folk who were not too keen on uranium mining happening in the Okanagan Valley amidst the fruit lands and the cattle ranching and all of that, would picket Bennett's Hardware Store every Friday afternoon. And there was a Catholic priest that would lead these sessions on Fridays. And when someone asked him about nuclear waste, he said, you know, if the earth was flat, you could just push it off the edge. But the earth is round. And it's always struck with me how in just a very few words, he sort of summarized the realization that we're coming to after all of these years of pretending that the earth was flat and you could just push things away, that it's actually circular. Everything moves in cycles, and we have to start behaving according to the rules of the place. This picture is one that some of you may have seen versions of. It's a so-called Venn diagram in which the economy the environment, and the society are represented as three spheres, with sustainability in the middle where they intersect. What's wrong with this picture? What kind of economic activity is going on out here outside of the environment? I'd like to know. And what kind of society is going on out here outside of the economy and the environment? It really makes no sense when you stop to think about it. And our view, again, is shifting and evolving, and we now, I think, are increasingly understanding that our economy is embedded inside our society. And the whole thing is embedded inside the ecosphere in which our societies and our economies are built up and thrive. And as Scott was referring to, there are some limits. There are some rules about the way you can behave in this place. Everything goes somewhere. You can't push anything off the edge. Everything is connected. You've heard these rules before. And that means really you can never do just one thing. Try as you might. The interconnectivity in the Earth planet system makes it impossible to ever do just one thing. And nature is an independent power. Perhaps some of you had the privilege that I had of knowing Ursula Franklin, one of the great Canadian professors at the University of Toronto, a Quaker, a peace activist, one of the founders of the Voice of Women, really a great Canadian. And I heard her lecture once on this point. You can't negotiate with nature. It's just physics and chemistry. We can't say, would you settle for a 20% reduction in emissions? There isn't going to be a negotiation on this. So this was to be a video, but we couldn't get it working, so I'll just show you very quickly for those of you who are looking for bad news. This very, very thin line on the right-hand side of this graph is the growth in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that's occurred basically in the last 150 years or so. And the graph goes all the way back to 800,000 years before the present. So you'll see this graph of increasing greenhouse gas emissions stretched out sometime. But from Gaia's perspective, this is a hammer blow. This is not some gradual increase. This is in physics, what we would call a delta function, where you absolutely bring in a very large, sharp signal, and they are inevitably extremely disruptive to the systems in which they are introduced. And that, in a nutshell, is what we've triggered with our fossil fuel consumption over the last 150 years. We have delivered a hammer blow to Gaia, and Gaia is now responding. David Suzuki sometimes calls it the slow motion emergency. By the time we realize the trouble we're in, which is about now, the system has developed such inertia and momentum that it's going to take some time to reverse the trend. I quote Joni Mitchell here, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. But we are headed to 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. The ecosystem impacts, this system's never been hit with a hammer like that. So you can do a certain amount of modeling and predicting about what we're in for, but this is an unprecedented situation that the Earth system finds itself in, and we're really making it up as we go here in terms of what we might expect in this very large, interconnected, non-linear system that we call home when you introduce such a sharp, strong blow to one of its big systems, the atmospheric system. This picture, by the way, is taken on Greenland. Maybe some of you have seen it before. I've been using it for over 10 years. And this is basically the water melt from the surface of the Greenland ice flowing down these moulins, as they're called, where it eventually gets to the bottom of the ice sheet. What does it do there? It lubricates the movement of the sheet and speeds up its progression into the sea. Just one tiny little example of the type of feedback loop that we set in motion when we disturb the system. All of the impacts are local. That's why this is a local issue. It's why I think most of you are probably here. This will come to Lanark County. If you haven't already noticed, it's probably here. It's going to come in the form of lethal heat waves. It's going to come in the form of wildfires. And again, I've been using this slide for 10 years. It's going to come in the form of out-of-control hydrological cycles with the flooding that comes along with that. This from Minden in 2017. And it's going to come with increased intensity and frequency of extreme storms. This photograph is from Dunrobin, 2018. I lived in Ottawa for 18 years. Never thought of Ottawa as a hurricane risk area, but it's become one, as I'm sure you all know. So we've got to smarten up, and we have to start behaving according to those planetary limits and those rules which I was mentioning a moment ago. And what would the energy system of a sustainable future look like? Well, it would run on renewables, obviously. It would match the sources to the end uses. In other words, it would have very little waste. You wouldn't use the best example of this are these big central power plants that are way out of scale to the human energy needs that they're providing, where we will use a controlled nuclear fission reaction to heat up water, to boil it, to make steam, to turn a turbine, move the electricity hundreds of kilometers, and run it through a wire to heat up a room 5 degrees. It would be comical if it weren't so tragic. And it's the same with our cars. Our cars, they weigh like 2 tons, carrying our little 100 kilogram or 150 kilogram bodies around, as the case may be, so we can get a quart of milk. I mean, it's so stupid that one hardly can believe that we have failed to come up with a design and an engineering approach to our technology, which is more efficient and more in line with the planetary limits that we were describing earlier. Obviously, we can't be generating these greenhouse gas emissions, certainly not at a rate higher than Gaia is able to breathe them back in again. We have to recognize there is no waste in nature. It's not a concept that you'll see in ecology. It's an economic concept. And of course, we'll probably never get to zero waste, but that has to be the aspiration. We need a system with no toxic waste, no radioactive waste, in fact, no waste at all. It needs to be resilient and diverse so that when it fails, it fails safely and doesn't depend on engineering systems to prevent catastrophic consequences or ecocidal consequences. And these are all basically design principles that one learns just by looking at the way nature does things, which is the way we have to behave now. We have to shift our engineering and our design to mimic nature. In fact, there's a term biomimicry that many of you, I'm sure, are probably familiar with that develops this idea, and there's a book by that title that develops this idea quite fully. We need to start making things the way nature does it by adhering to these kinds of principles. I think when it comes to the energy transition that Scott already made reference to, we weren't sure 25 or 30 years ago exactly what the mix of responses needed to be, but there's a very strong global consensus now on what the fundamental elements of this energy transition must look like. There are variations. Some people like nuclear, some people don't. Some people want biofuels and think we can do that sustainably. Some people don't. But the big picture is everybody, first of all, agrees that energy efficiency has to be the central principle of everything we do with our vehicles, our buildings, our transport systems, our industrial systems, and so on. We need to stop wasting energy. Secondly, electricity's role expands into transportation and heat. This is new. When we did the first soft energy path study, which is a study of the potential for conservation and renewable energy in Canada in 1981, we tried to not put too much electricity into our scenario because we couldn't imagine how you could possibly provide it in a sustainable way. We didn't have the electric cars yet. We didn't have the heat pumps. We didn't have the declining costs of solar and wind power that has happened since then. But there's a strong consensus now that electrifying the end uses of energy is absolutely critical to the achievement of a more sustainable energy system. Of course, the electricity also has to not be a source of emissions, and so you'll hear people discuss, and you'll hear about it today, I'm sure, how we have to decarbonize the electricity supply. It's interesting, in Canada, British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, Newfoundland are already basically operating with extremely low carbon electricity. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, not so much, although they're trying to get away from it. And Ontario, New Brunswick are sort of intermediate with a mix of fossil, nuclear, and renewables. But in general, on a national basis, Canada has one of the lowest carbon footprints in its electricity system of any country in the world. It's right there with Brazil and Norway and other major hydro powers. I mentioned already, biofuels will probably have a role in this future. There are some things at this point, like long-distance aviation and long-distance trucking, which have so far eluded a sensible electrification strategy. And finally, even if you do all of this, if you do all of the efficiency and do all of the decarbonization of electricity and electrify the end uses, we can't keep going on the way we've been going in terms of our levels of consumption of energy services. And so we need innovation to continue to move us. Innovation, and I would say probably also the behavior and value changes to move us in the direction of where we need less fuel and electricity to get the things that we really care about in the first place. Nobody wants fuel. You know, there's no demand for fuel or electricity. You don't want a kilowatt hour in your hand. Believe me, it hurts. And nobody wants a barrel of oil in their living room. These things are just there because of the role that they play in getting us the things that we really do care about. And it's a short list. We want to be comfortable, we want to be healthy, we want to be safe, we want to be self-realized and happy. That's about it. And to the extent that we can figure out how to do that in ways that stay within those planetary limits and respect the circularity of this planet that we're living on, then that's the direction that we need to go in. And it will result in a less intense demand for energy services and energy commodities. And we need that. And that actually has been happening. One of the reasons we haven't had any electricity growth in this province now for, since 2008, believe it or not, was when electricity consumption in this province had its historic peak, is because our economy is shifting in ways that we get the things that we care about. Even with population and economic growth, we're using less electricity today than we were in 2008, significantly less. So there are some complications, as I think has already been pretty clear from some of the doom and gloom slides of Scott and myself. It's going to continue to get worse even as we try to fix it. The time that we've got to deal with is kind of short compared to the inertia in the system. And as I mentioned earlier, nature is not going to negotiate with us on this. We've got to deal with these rules that govern the way the planet behaves. And it's really a big, complicated system. There's a lot going on. Technologically, I think now most people who are working on this would say that is not what's holding us back. Yes, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are some areas like long-distance shipping and long-distance aviation where it's going to be continuing source of research and innovation to figure out how we're going to get there. But in general, we have the technology we need to be going 10 or 20 times faster than we are towards decarbonizing our system. The other good news is that these solutions, and this is so important when you're talking about what you can do in your local communities, these solutions, almost without exception, bring with them other benefits, whether it's improved air quality, whether it's a more profitable company or a more comfortable home or a more, a safer and more comfortable driving experience. More efficient, low carbon technologies are better technologies. The reason electric car sales are going through the roof is not because everyone that's buying them is concerned about climate change. I wish that were the case. They're just wonderful cars. And you'll see this theme repeat itself over and over again. I work with business mostly in the last few years, and many of the big businesses, and these guys, they'll just say, look, this is where the money is. That's why we're doing it. So you got to go with that. And we'll come back to that theme because I want to say a little bit specifically about strategies for having an impact in your community that has to do with how you leverage these other benefits. It's going to take a big workforce. I mean, we worry about productivity in this country. I mean, you could solve the productivity problem by tackling climate change. I mean, you could get everybody to work doing really valuable jobs that need to be done. And if anything, this is one of the bottlenecks. We don't have the workforce. If we decided to retrofit all the buildings in this country tomorrow, we don't have the workforce that would even know how to do it. It's hard enough to find a contractor that understands it in a town like Cobourg. I don't know if that's the same here in Perth. Probably not. This is a pretty cool, hip place. But man, I renovated a 100-year-old house and I had no end of arguments with my contractor. Why would you want to put that much insulation in there? Ralph, that doesn't make any sense. You're just wasting your money, blah, blah, blah. Lots of conversations like that. We are at a point in our economy where our infrastructure is up for renewal anyway. That big boom in the 60s and 70s, that stuff's wearing out. This is actually an opportunity if we are smart enough to seize it. Some considerations. This transition isn't the only one that's going on, you might have noticed. And some of them are going to help us and some of them are not. To take one example right from our own country, the housing crisis in Canada could be tackled in a way that would actually advance the climate change agenda, or if there's a panicked response to the crisis that results in a lot of substandard housing being constructed quickly that's not very energy efficient, it could actually make it worse. And you can go through other crises here and around the world which sometimes help and sometimes don't address the climate crisis. So that's another one of the things that makes this a complicated problem. It's capital intensive. So what? Why does everybody get so excited about the fact it's expensive? It's not like we don't do expensive things all the time. I mean, look at our electricity system, our road system, or any other number of big projects that we've done. Look at any of the rich countries. They got rich by doing big, expensive things and figuring out how to spread the cost out over long time periods so that it could be done and it could be affordable and that front end cost could be managed. So the capital cost of this future is not a fundamental barrier. It can be solved at the speed of human thought. Innovation in financing and business strategies. This is just a variation of the point I just made. Probably, as I said, it's not technology that's holding us up. It's a failure of the private sector to come up with the business plans and the public sector to come up with the supporting policies that can actually crack that first cost problem and accelerate the pace at which we're implementing and deploying these technologies. Education and literacy is critical. That's why meetings like this one this morning are so important. One of the reasons that education and literacy is critical, and I'll go dark here for a minute for those of you who need another fix. There has, in fact, it's one of the things that got me interested in environmentalism. There is lurking in the background the potential of a type of eco-fascistic response to the environmental crisis. Thankfully, we haven't really seen it emerge, but it could. And if that happens, or if, for example, a leader like Donald Trump decides to take on the environment instead of trying to deny it's a problem, it's going to be really important that there is widespread understanding in city halls, in communities, at the grassroots level, that the way to deal with this problem is not necessarily to destroy human civil liberties and political rights and freedoms. I'm no libertarian, believe me, but you can see a scenario out there where a right-wing environmental, an ultra-right-wing environmental movement could make this crisis really tear us apart instead of bringing us together. I've gone on too long about that point, but we can come back to it if you're interested. And the solutions vary according to local circumstances. Again, that's why it's so gratifying to see a full room here this morning, because while we can say there's some general solutions, the buildings have to get more efficient and the cars have to get electric, how that happens, how that gets deployed is going to vary according to the circumstances from one community to the next. So we need local agency to be right at the middle of this response. Some more good news. I'm conscious of the time and I'm bad. As David Posh is here, he'll tell you I'm the world's worst chronologically challenged person. But the cost of the technological solutions has been coming down at a breathtaking rate. And by that I mean at a rate we have never seen in the whole history of energy technology, not with oil, not with coal, not with natural gas. These declining cost curves for electric vehicle batteries, for storage batteries, for wind turbines, for solar panels, these are lifesavers, literally. This is why we now, as I said earlier, see electrification as a feasible, possible strategy for tackling the climate crisis. The other thing I would say, and this is interesting, the solutions are growing faster than the problem. The solutions are tiny compared to the size of the problem, but they're growing much, much faster. So who knows how this is going to end? It's very hard with such a complicated system to say which curve is going to win out. It's kind of like going out in your garden and you see a little bit of crabgrass growing in the corner, and then you go out 2 weeks later and lo and behold, it's covering half your garden. I mean, these faint signals, and in spite of the very high rates of growth of electric vehicles and clean electricity and all the rest of it, and the heat pump phenomenon, they still represent relatively small percentages of our total supply of energy. However, they're growing at double-digit rates year after year, over 20% per year in many cases globally. And we cannot be as aware of that here in Canada because we are, where the growth is highest is in Europe and in China, and actually Asia in general. And North America, including Canada and the United States, are playing a little bit of catch-up in terms of trying to accelerate the deployment of these things. But yeah, the deployment of these technologies is one of the big, hopeful, good news stories in this whole situation. And as some of you may have read, if you follow this, for the last 2 years now, capital invested in the clean economy, so in these new technologies, has been growing faster and has now overtaken capital being invested in the legacy economy. So there's a race. We took a look at this during the pandemic, at what it might look like for Canada to really get the carbon out of our economy. This is all on the Corporate Knights website, but basically we added up the capital costs. The big one is the buildings, $126 billion. was the total for all of these added together. We looked at retrofitting the buildings. That's the first two. These are residential. This is commercial buildings, transportation sector, renewable electricity development, and then heavy industry and agriculture. And the Royal Bank and the Government of Canada came up with similar numbers, somewhere in the range of $125 to $140 billion per year in investment would be needed over the course of the next 10 to 20 years to decarbonize the Canadian economy. So a couple of $1 trillion over 20 years. And this, Canada's a $2 trillion a year economy. So it's a big number, but we can afford it. Just to put that number in a little bit more context, I'm sorry for all the good news given the straw poll, but I'll try and get gloomy if I can later. Here's our plan, $126 billion a year. This is what is, 2 years ago now, this is what would be the cost of not acting by 2030 would be up around $150 billion a year. This is the federal response to COVID, $250 billion a year, 2 years in a row. This is more or less the total capital spent every year, capital investment in Canada, about $450–500 billion a year. And as I said earlier, this is the size of the Canadian economy, measured as gross domestic product, for whatever that means. So, you know, it's 6%. And this same number comes up in other countries who have looked at what it would really take if we started tackling this problem like the emergency we keep saying it is. About 6% of GDP would have to go into this. So about something a little less than the GST would have to be spent on this for the next 20 years. And we'd be done. The fossil fuel era would be someplace that we came from. I'm conscious that I started later than I thought I would, and I don't want to derail the morning, so I'm going to speed up a bit. These slides will be available, however, and I'm quite happy to answer questions, including by email, if you are going through the slides later and have questions. This particular one is just a series about our transportation sector. We just finished looking at what it would cost to electrify all of the vehicles in Canada, and I put it at about $666 billion. When it came out to that number, I really wanted to change it. You know, I didn't want it to be 666, but I was too much of a scientist to fudge it. So, and the current rate that we're spending is about $60 billion a year on decarbonizing our transportation sector. So it's a big gap. But just going back a slide for a second, take a look at the numbers. You probably can't, I'm sure you can't read these at the back. But every year, Canadians spend $72 billion on vehicles, $41 billion putting gasoline into them, $35 billion parking. That doesn't even count the land. $35 billion in parking. Not so much in Lanark County, I expect, but it's a big problem in Toronto. Infrastructure, another $30 billion. That's mostly government spending for roads and bridges and so on. Vehicle maintenance, another $25 billion a year. By the way, a lot of that goes away with electrification. These cars don't need much maintenance. And then another $10 billion on insurance. It's $220 billion a year we're already spending on our transportation system. And we're suggesting that we need to spend about $600 billion over 20 years to fix it. So $30 billion a year on a system which is currently already absorbing $220 billion a year out of Canadians' pockets. So again, we hear these big numbers and they sound scary, but when you put them into the context of the size of Canada and the richness of Canada and the capabilities of Canadians and Canadian institutions and households and companies, we can do this. This is why you folks live in Lanark County. This is a picture of the 401 on a November evening during rush hour. You know, although I have to tell you, the per capita automobile use is probably higher in Lanark County than it is in the city. It's something that, the dirty little secret about moving back to the land, you spend a lot of time in your car. But Canadians travel 400 billion kilometers a year. I get a big kick out of that. It's 2,500 times the distance from here to the sun every year. And yet we're right back where we started at the end of that year. So it seems, again, it would be comical if it weren't so tragic. And then we started to break it down. That's just showing here's what we're spending compared to where we think it needs to go. So it has to ramp up. And then we broke it down into personal vehicles, commercial trucks and fleets, and the public charging infrastructure. The public charging infrastructure is only 5% of the cost of doing this, but it's really critical because if the charging infrastructure doesn't stay out in front of the curve, people won't have the confidence that they need to go in and get the electric vehicle because they'll be worried, maybe needlessly, but it doesn't matter. The worry itself is the problem. And they'll buy another gas vehicle because they'll think, well, I'm not sure the chargers are going to be where I need them when I need them. And I'm sure Steve will address this point. I've seen Steve's slides, so that also allows me to speed up over some of these points. By the way, if you did this, the savings over the 20-year period, just in fuel alone, add up to $1 trillion. So it would pay for itself, even before you add in the lower maintenance and the carbon savings. We've done a similar exercise for buildings with similar results, and I really am going to speed through them. I apologize, but probably also about $30 billion a year would be needed to get our retrofits going at the rate that they need to be. I want to make a point about electrification since that's the topic here today. Electrification brings with it enormous efficiency gains, and I know Steve is going to get into this a bit more, so I will again gloss over it. But electric cars are 5 times more efficient than gas cars. Heat pumps are 2 to 3 to 3.5 times more efficient than gas furnaces. And so when you go to electrification, the pie that we were looking at earlier of energy use in Canada by end use, it gets a lot smaller. And that's one of the reasons electrification is the centerpiece of the decarbonization strategies. Here's an interesting example of how these different things have positive synergies. More positive news, I'm afraid. But at the top, we have a 4-house neighborhood, so it's just meant to be representative. 3 of them are heated with natural gas, and 1 of them is heated with baseboards, which isn't too far off the average in Ontario. I would say maybe about 20% of our residential stock is using electric resistance heating. They've all got a car, and the total grid electricity use of that 4-house neighborhood is 121,000 kilowatt hours a year. We retrofit them. We put heat pumps in, including the electric resistance heated one. 2 of them have solar panels on the roof, 4,000 kilowatt hours a year, so a fairly modest solar system. After you're finished doing this conversion, the total electricity use of the 4 homes is actually lower by half than it was before you started. And we see these kinds of things all the time with electrification. Even individual commercial buildings that are heated with gas, after you electrify them and convert them to heat pumps and do a few efficiency improvements on the lights and the other systems, the electricity use, after you switch them from gas to electric heating, can actually be lower than it was before. Very counterintuitive, but that's the nature of the synergistic benefits that electrification brings. Okay, I just want to very briefly say a little bit, since the organizers asked us to bring this back to local action. I spent about 15 years of my life working with local governments, so my comments about local action tend to be focused on local governments, but I think that they're generally applicable to communities. And because of that point I made earlier, that the circumstances vary from one community to another for how you deploy these solutions, it's critical that local agency be involved in the transition. Secondly, I'll say, I was asking my wife about this because she's more of a local activist than I am. I have my, I'm working on sort of higher's not the right word, but bigger picture systems analysis. And I asked her, so what should I tell the folks in Lanark? And I'm not sure you need to be told much, because I remember 10 years ago, we used to use Perth as an example for what other communities should be doing. But one thing I would say is the senior governments are not going to do this for you. They're not going to show up. You talk to people who were in communities in British Columbia last year, nobody came to help. If you're the first fire or the first flood of the year, maybe you'll get some help. But these floods and fires and events are going to become fairly normal as we go forward. So you're going to have to organize to deal with them. You need to have a plan for how to deal with these killer heat waves. That has to be a local plan, and you need to rehearse it. You have to have strategies for coping with whatever the climate change impacts are most likely to be in this area, and I expect it's fires and heat waves here. So that's one thing. And then secondly, she said, local politicians often will say, nobody ever writes me letters about climate change. That's a federal government problem. That's a provincial government problem. And so local politicians need to be educated about just how important community action and local government action is in accelerating the climate transition and in supporting their populations in coping with the consequences of climate change that are here and are going to be getting worse for some time to come. I know I'm over, but this is just a list of all the various ways that local governments influence GHG emissions: building codes, parks, transportation systems. I mean, the list just goes on and on. Local governance is climate action planning, whether you call it that or not. The capital budgets and the operating budgets of local governments will tell you quite a bit about what the future level of greenhouse gas emissions in that community is going to look like. And they make decisions that last for a long, long time. Urban planning decisions have impacts for 100 years. How you lay out a neighborhood, which in turn determines how automobile dependent it is and so on. These are all things that you need to get right as you go along, or you end up paying a lot more later to try and fix them. So I would say that, to echo again a point I made earlier, that you'll find that many of the other community aspirations can be addressed by tackling, by having a climate action plan and by working together to implement it. And again, I'm speeding through this, but it's interesting when you ask local authorities who are working on this issue why they're doing it. They say, well, mainly for the economic benefits, the local environmental benefits, the better air quality. They feel it improves community resilience, public health benefits, obviously, social benefits, because of the synergies that you can achieve in areas like housing by tackling climate change and housing as an integrated problem. Climate change wasn't on the top 5 list when the local authorities who had climate action plans were asked why. They do it for all of the other ancillary benefits. So more good news. Leverage is important. And again, this is a slide that I'll just leave in the deck, but on the left-hand side are the key decision makers in your community that will determine the level and the pattern of greenhouse gas emissions. And on the right-hand side are the things they care about. And reducing greenhouse gas emissions is on that list somewhere. But if you are not addressing the things that really motivate people in the different sectors, then you'll have a hard time building the momentum and the community participation and support that you need to really make rapid progress on addressing climate change. I'm going to just also say that this is the pattern of electricity consumption in Ontario back from 2003. You can see it peaking actually in 2005. I said 2008 earlier, but it was already on its way down. And this is right up to the end of last year. So you can see there's something going on here. In spite of the heat pumps, in spite of the electric vehicles, we are not seeing this feared doubling and tripling of the grid that everybody keeps beating the drum about. And I'm not saying the grid isn't going to have to get bigger, but I think if we do this in a smart way, and if we take advantage of the synergies, then we should be able to make this transition to a more electrified province in a way that avoids blowing the budget, and which will lead to stronger and more resilient grid and stronger and more resilient communities. The grid that's coming is not a bigger version of the one that we have. It's something very, very new and very, very different. It will have much more local interconnectivity. It will have information and energy flowing in every which way, as opposed to the old hub and spoke model of the electric grid. And communities' electricity and therefore energy supply will be more resilient and more reliable as a result. These are themes I'm sure we'll be coming back to as the day proceeds. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for hanging in there. And I'm sorry I raced through some of those sections, but you can circle back and look at them if you're interested. And as I said, I'm happy to engage by email if they evoke any questions.